Solomon, welcome to Booktopia.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Your book, Far From the Tree, took 10 years to write and is based on 300 interviews. What was your starting point?
I had written an article for the New York Times Magazine some years ago about deaf culture. It was an assignment that was given to me by my editors. I'd never heard of deaf culture. I thought deafness was a disability and a tragedy. And I went out into the deaf community and began to understand that there really was a culture, that it was organized around the shared use of sign language, that there were deaf clubs, that there was deaf theater. I went to the National Association of the Deaf meeting. I even went to the Miss Deaf America contest in Nashville, Tennessee. And as I plunged deeper and deeper into the deaf world, I thought, it is a culture, and it is quite a beautiful culture. And I remember walking into the National Association of the Deaf meeting and having a moment of thinking, I wish I were deaf. Not that I wish to give up my hearing, which I actually make a lot of use of, but I saw all of these people rushing toward each other and embracing, and all the conversations of flying hands all over the place. And I thought it would be wonderful to be part of this in this instance, in this moment. And then I discovered that most deaf children are born to hearing parents, that those parents tend to try to incorporate them into the hearing world by teaching them at that point lip reading and oral speech. And that a lot of those deaf people discover signing deaf culture in adolescence when it comes as a great liberation to them. And as I spent time in that world, I thought how similar it was to the experience of gay people who are mostly born to straight parents, who mostly would like them to function in what they see as the real world, and who often discover gay culture in adolescence or thereafter when it comes as a glorious revelation to them. And then a friend of mine had a daughter who was a dwarf. And my friend Leslie came over and she began recounting what her friend Lisa had said. And she said, Lisa's wondering what she should do. And she said, do I tell her she's just like everyone else, but she's shorter? Or do I somehow try to get her to become aware of herself as a dwarf and get involved with the little people of America? And as Leslie told me about Lisa, I thought, okay, here the whole thing is again. You have a family that thinks of itself as normal, and they have this child who is totally different. And how on earth are they going to make sense of that experience? And I found myself getting drawn into the idea that if this was true for deaf people and gay people and dwarfs, it must be true for a lot of other people and a lot of other circumstances too.
Well, I hope to come back to that in a moment, but I want to ask you also, you write the first chapter as a son and you write the last chapter as a father. What did you learn about the business of being a parent between being a son and becoming a father?
Well, that's a huge question, and possibly you should wait till my children grow up and ask them. But I would say, essentially, that I really recognized as I worked on the book that there are two things that are required of parents. And one is love, and the other is acceptance. And while we all know stories of hideous abuse and neglect, I think most parents are capable of love, and most parents love their children. But I think accepting your child for who he or she really is a process, and it takes time, and it requires a lot of conscious struggle, and you have to get away from how you imagined your child was going to be and enter into the realm of who your child actually is. And I found that acceptance is the thing that people need to be awake to. Now, I think acceptance needs to be the ultimate goal of love, acceptance, even celebration, which can follow on acceptance. But I feel like I had experienced deficits in my parents' acceptance as deficits in love, and they weren't deficits. My parents always loved me. Deficits in acceptance. So what am I like as a father? I'm trying to be a very accepting father. I'm trying to see my children for who they are. I'm trying to be sure that the ways that I love them are not influenced by what they achieve or what they accomplish or by some abstract standard of what I think constitutes a successful life. I want them to be successful on their own terms. Now, having said that, when I was a child, I loved zoos. And we took my son, who's 5 today, who's here with me in Sydney, to the Taronga Zoo. And George actually doesn't love zoos. And it became clear shortly after we got there that he was in quite a grumpy mood and that he was not very interested in seeing the wallabies and so on and so forth. And I kept thinking, but this is such a wonderful day, George. Why aren't you appreciating it? And I thought to myself, oh yes, do not give your children the childhood you wanted. Try to figure out how to give your children the childhood they want. And that's the thing that I think is the task of parenthood. And I'm not sure that I'm doing it, but at least I'm aware of it in a way I wouldn't have been without this book.
So really what you're talking about there is unconditional love. And I guess that the group in your book that test that possibly beyond the bounds of any other, and that in a sense are the most, the group that I would describe, if you like, as the misfits in the overarching theory, are the children who commit crimes, because these are children, these are individuals who do things that are not a character trait that they are born with. And I was wondering at what point you made the decision that you would include a chapter in which you would talk to the parents of children who had committed terrible crimes, including, for example, the Columbine massacre.
I was very interested in the idea that the impediments to parental love that I was writing about could come not only from a condition with which your child was born, but also with where your child came from, hence a chapter on children born conceived in rape, and also in what they did, so hence the chapter on children who commit crimes. The issue that I found most interesting as I worked on the crime chapter was the issue of blame. We used to say that people were gay because they had overbearing mothers and passive fathers. And we used to say that people had autism because they had refrigerator mothers who were very cold with them. And we used to say they had schizophrenia because their parents nurtured an unconscious wish that they not exist. And if you go back a couple of 100 years, we used to say that children were born with deformities or dwarfism because of the mother's unexpressed lascivious longings. And we finally stopped blaming parents for all of those things. And yet we continue relentlessly to blame parents for children who commit crimes. And I wanted to see whether, meeting these families, I would understand what it was that they had all done wrong that caused their children to be like this. And I found that in many instances, the parents really had done things that were very difficult for their children that may have potentiated the criminal tendencies that were there. But in other cases, I met deeply caring, deeply engaged, loving parents whose children had some brokenness in them or had some anxiety that manifested in criminal behavior, or whose children got seduced by the intimacy that life in a gang represented, or who had any of those other experiences. And I wanted to look at how those parents cope, because there are support groups all over the place for parents of children with Down syndrome or parents of children with autism. Parents of children who commit crimes don't have much access to one another, and they could really use it because a lot of them are effectively innocent, and because a lot of them really want their children to do well. And they're frequently distressed both by the harm their children have done to others and by the way in which their children seem not to be able to compass a life that's going to exist within the confines of the law, and that's therefore going to be matched with the relative peace and calm that comes with being a law-abiding citizen. And that despair that they had was extremely compelling to me, and I felt it hadn't been written about.
Andrew, you gave a dazzling opening address at the Sydney Writers' Festival this year, and I'm just wondering, the message of your book, which is of acceptance and tolerance, that was obviously the subject of that speech, you quoted 3 times, I think, from biblical texts or from Christian texts, and I'm just wondering, is there an underlying message, a Christian message, to what you're saying in your writing?
I'm interested that you ask it in that way. I don't think there is an underlying Christian message per se. I did find, as I spoke about the book and I went around the United States, that often there were people who felt that if it had moral content, it must have Christian content. And I feel like I didn't want to associate it with the details of Christianity, but I did want people to feel comfortable with the moral conversation. I found that scattering in a few biblical references was a help. What I saw as I did the research was that the greatest acts of selfless kindness and generosity seem to have come out of Christianity. I encountered the most remarkable people who had adopted multiple disabled children because they thought God had a purpose for them, and who loved children who seemed difficult to love because they believed there was a reason they had been given those children, and they believed it was service to God. And I encountered the worst, pettiest, most hideous prejudice cloaked in the language of Christianity, especially when I worked on the chapter on children who are transgender. In the address that I gave on the opening night, I talked about a woman with a transgender child who had been driven out of her town and effectively had her life destroyed, and the people who led that whole process were the members of the Baptist church in her town. So I ended up thinking Christianity existed at the poles of greatest tolerance and of greatest intolerance, and I'm interested by it as a thread in the fabric of our society. I'm Jewish myself, But I live in a country that's largely a Christian country, and I really wanted to make sure that I didn't leave that out of the conversation, because I think a purely secular understanding of the experience of these families would not be honest to what all of them were dealing with.
Now, also, in that opening address, you were incredibly candid about your own experiences with depression. And I'm just wondering, I couldn't help but wonder after I'd heard your speech, whether if you think your understanding of depression would have been different if you had written this book, Far from the Tree, first, before the book that you wrote about your own depression, if you had understood difference and if you had understood commonality way back when you were first afflicted with depression, do you think you would have had a different view?
That is a fascinating question, and one I have never been asked before, and I do think that it would have been different, and I'm trying to think exactly how. I think I would have understood the importance of community, and that when I was depressed, I would have found community in a way that I didn't at the time. Now, also, my original depression was in 1994, and the internet wasn't as advanced then as it is now. And if you wanted community, you mostly had to go to sort of support groups that were in the basements of hospitals and were themselves so depressing that it was hard to imagine that they could be of any help to anyone. And I did go to some of those for research, and I thought, ooh. But I think now I would have found a sense of community. But I think more significantly, I would have thought to myself, this depression is very unwelcome. Depression is an inherently painful condition. It's not just that it's stigmatized, it's that its very defining characteristic is anguish. Nonetheless, it is also in some sense an identity, and there is growth to be achieved through it. And I think if I had seen how all of these families found ultimately ways to construct meaning around their experience of difference, I would have looked at my depression and thought, I will be able to make something out of this. That would not have made the depression go away, but it might have made it easier to tolerate. So yes, I think that would have been very different.
I couldn't help but wonder, after hearing your speech and also after reading your book, about something else, which was, if we accept certain differences and certain fates as our identity, whether it's something like dwarfism or being deaf, what other things about our fate should we perhaps accept? And I kept thinking about poverty and oppression. I know that those are things that we have the power to change, but I remember going to India and seeing people who were obviously very poor and disadvantaged, and also seeing a lot of joy amongst them, and being told by Indians that they were very accepting of their status and of their fate. So what do you think is the implication of your theory and your research for that kind of notion of identity?
So poverty, of course, is an identity, and people who are impoverished have life experiences in common that are foreign to those of us who are not impoverished. I think that's a sort of starting point. I was very struck as I did this work by how people's sense of agency bore on their ability to endure the experiences they were facing. And I sometimes come back to a story, and it's a difficult story to tell. It sounds sort of patronizing, but I happened on the same day to interview two women in a row, and one of them was a sort of wealthy society woman in New York who had a child with autism, and she had spent her whole life trying to fix his autism and make him better, and she had never been able to do it. He had basically progressed very little. He was now living in a home where he was taken care of. She went back and forth to visit him all the time. It was exhausting. It was very stressful. When he came to visit, they had to put all kinds of things away because he tended to smash everything. She described her life of such frustration. And then I interviewed a woman later on that same day who was someone who was an extremely impoverished woman who worked cleaning people's houses, who had migrated up from the Deep South, and who had a son who had almost exactly the same symptoms as the son of the first woman. And I said, does he smash up a lot of things in your house? And she said, whatever could get smashed up got smashed up a long time ago. And she really had this incredibly acute sense that she had never been able to fix what was wrong in her life. She had never tried to fix what was wrong in her son. She had simply accepted that that was who he was. She had assumed that she would find a way through, and she would find a way to bear these difficulties. Now, I don't want to sort of honey impoverished circumstances. Everything is easier when you have some money, and everything is harder when you're really poor. But I do think that sense of whether or not you have control over your life, whether you're accustomed to having control over your life, can sometimes work paradoxically, and that the people who are accustomed to control sometimes have the hardest time with children who are different in some profound way.
But Andrew, if you're right, and we have more in common than we have apart, if there is more that we share than that keeps us apart, why is that message so difficult for the world to accept? I was just talking a few days ago to Alice Walker, and 30 years on, The Colour Purple is still being the subject of bannings in various school authorities and states in America. Currently, North Carolina would rather that The Colour Purple were not available in libraries and in public institutions. Why is difference so much at the centre of our public conversations rather than similarity?
Well, first I'd like to say that there are in effect two Americas. There's sort of the, as they now call them, the blue America that I live in, which is a liberal and accepting place where we've had this enormous progress, where gay marriage has become legal, where services for disabled people are better than they've ever been. And then there's a red America in which prejudice reigns supreme, and in which people are still hung up not only on prejudice against the groups I've written about, whose rights are fairly recent, but as Alice Walker's story indicates, are even still, I think, prejudice against people because of their race, which is a battle we thought we'd won, some considerable time ago. That was behind us. I think people are frightened by difference. I think people feel as though their sense of coherence as a human being relies on being surrounded with people who are like them. And I think that they often find the encounter with difference very frightening, and they feel as though what they have, their material goods, their power, their ability to run and control their own lives, that those things will somehow be taken away from them by people who are different. And I think that's always been the case. I mean, I think that's why you have communities at war, not just internal prejudice, but what was the issue between Athens and Sparta? What was the issue, between Rome and the countries it conquered? The Romans wanted to make everything Roman because they felt a sense of security in making everyone else like them. And I think there's a sense in which people still want to make others very much like them and really battle quite strongly in an attempt to do it.
So having written this epic, remarkable book, Far From the Tree, which has so many important things to say to us now and I think forever, what on earth is next for you? How are you going to top this?
I've asked myself that question, and I don't know about topping it. But I have sold the idea for a new book, which I've just begun the very preliminary work on. It's about the idea that in an era in which women are likely to work and men are likely to be involved in childcare, our ideas of motherhood and fatherhood are gradually beginning to merge toward a single idea of parenthood, to examine what the social implications of that are, and to see how it's both occasioned by and reflected in single parents by choice, gay families, open adoptions in which people acknowledge both a birth family and an adoptive family, the increased foster care system, the existence now of complicated polyamorous families and so on, to look at all of the new structures of family and try to understand what has family been and what can it be.
Does this mean I'm going to have to wait another 10 years for the next book?
Oh, I hope not. I really want to get through this one faster. I've said 5, fingers crossed, but I said 5 for this one too. I get out into the world of the research, and these are complicated, big topics, and they take a long time to research, and then they take a long time to think through, not to mention having to write it all down.
It's been such an honor to meet you. Thank you so much, Andrew Solomon.
Thank you. Pleasure has been mine.